All right, so we are playing our chapter 2 Kahoot game. So let's see how well this made sense. Okay, so we have the following code, and we have I love C++ all in separate cout statements, but because there's no end line and there's no \n, it doesn't actually put them in separate lines in the output. Just because they're in separate cout statements doesn't mean that they'll be in separate lines in the output. So it actually will put them all up against each other. And because there's no spaces before, the quotes here, then you also won't get any spaces. So actually run everything right up against each other. Okay, so good job. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so you need some end L's or some \n's in there, or at least some spaces. Okay, so good job. So if you're looking here, we have this variable called total. It's an integer, which means the whole number, and it has the value 15. So 15 is called the integer literal. Okay, it's just a value. Literal is a value. And then we are assigning that to the variable total. So we call that initializing, just a fancy word for giving it the value. And then we're saying the total is here. So this is just a label for what the value is. But the problem is with the total variable, we put quotes around it. So it's actually going to print the word total instead of printing what's in total. So if you took the quotes off this, it would print 15. But if you have quotes on it, it'll actually print the word total. And because there's no space here, which we need to have, then it actually will push this word right up against that. And even if you didn't have the quotes on there, it'll push 15 right up against the word is, and that wouldn't look nice either. So this is like a thing like run it, see like, oops, I need to take the quotes off, and I also need to add a space after the S, and then it should be good. That makes sense already? Okay, good job. Okay, job. Let's take a look. So we have this variable, the name is A and it's an integer. And then we have these two values, 15 and 7, and 15 is a whole number and 7 is a whole number, which means you're going to get a whole number answer. It actually really doesn't even matter what A is because the data type of A doesn't affect the outcome of the division that we have on the right-hand side. So when you're doing the division, it actually just matters what two values you're using, whether those are variables or whether those are actual values. But if those both are integers, if they're whole numbers, then you get a whole number response. So typically 15 divided by 7 is not 2. It has a decimal answer, but because they're both integers, then it is 2, and you just chop the ending off. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. If you just make it 15.0 or 7.0, it would give you the decimal answer if you wanted that decimal answer. So let's take a look. So this means remainder, right? So if you take, now you have to be careful. So with modulus, you can never have decimal numbers that you're actually doing the modulus with. So always make sure you have two whole numbers when you're doing modulus. So 18 modulus 7, you say how many times does 7 go into 18? So it should go 2 times, and then 2 times 7 is 14, right? And then you take 18 minus 14 to get 4. So make sure it's not how many times does it divide, it's how many times after you divide, how many is left. So after you divide it, you subtract to find how much is left. It's kind of a weird question, but sometimes it works. It helps you with like figuring out how much change you have left after you've given somebody quarters or dimes or nickels, so you can move on to the next increment. So it's very helpful with some different situations. We don't use it all the time, and it's kind of a new one, so I expect that it's a little more difficult. But does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Okay. So which of the following is not a valid assignment statement? And so you can never start with a number and go this way. So this way you can't do. You do start with the data type and then the variable. And then, oh yeah, so this is correct, right? So this way is not correct. And then these are all correct. So we're saying which one is not. So that might have been tricky, but should be not. I should capitalize that or bold that. But this one's not correct, but this one is correct because you have the data type, you have the variable, you have the value, and it's in the correct order. A char is a data type. I know we wouldn't really use it much. It stands for character. And then the variable name would be letter. And then for the char, you put single quotes. I know it's kind of strange and we haven't used it much, so that might have been tricky. This one is fine. A string is more than one character, and then name is the name of the variable. And then Bob is what is in there, and string gets double quotes around it. So that's correct as well. So these, again, are called literals, and they always have to go on the right-hand side of the equals. But then you always have to have the data type and the variable on the left. Or if you don't have the data type, you have to have it further up. Like you have to say the variable data type earlier on, and then you can say the variable name equals and put the value in there. So you don't have to do it all at once, but you have to have it at some point before you use it. That make sense, everybody? Okay, and again, this is just the order of this one. It has everything, but the order is incorrect. Good job. So if you wanted to store someone's age, which one would you use? Well, you wouldn't use a double because that's a decimal. So I never heard anyone answer in a decimal format for their age. Same thing with float. Float is also a decimal, just less precision. A char, might work, but only if you only had one digit. If you have more than one digit, then that wouldn't be a char. So as soon as you get into the double digits for age, then that would no longer work. So int would be the option that would work. Make sense to everybody? Yeah. Let's see how we did. Okay. All right, good job. So today what I want to do is I want to go over some programs with you. So I'm going to use online GDB, but if you want to use a different editor, that's fine. So we are going to do a program together, and if you want to do it and save it, that would be great, so you have it. Okay, so it starts off like this, and I always add at the top using namespace so that I don't have to do that STD, because remember, you have to do this STD with everything. If you don't do that, but if you put using namespace up here STD, then you don't have to do that with every single line. And we're going to have a few out statements on this, so it'd be nice to not have to do that. And I can actually take up this hello world altogether. Okay, And then we're going to go ahead and put our comments up at the top. So put your name. Today's date is the 5th. Okay. And then we're going to say something like calculate stock commission. And then I'm going to end my comment there. Now, before I get started, I would like to do some pseudocode so I know what I'm doing. Because if you don't do pseudocode, sometimes you can be on the wrong track and you start coding and you realize you weren't really thinking about the problem correctly and you have to start all over again. So it's nice to kind of have something to work from. You thought about the problem before you've actually started coding it. So before we get started, we're going to do a little pseudocode here. And pseudocode can be, you know, whatever you want it to be. It's just kind of a way to keep track of what you're trying to achieve. And so there's no real format for it, but I'm going to write pseudocode at the top and then write my pseudocode. Okay, so I need to think about what I need to have in my program. So I need to have a commission percent to figure out how much I'm going to be charged. What's the percentage? And so the percentage is going to be a decimal number. So let's say it's like 2%. We're going to say 0.02. But because the commission percent, we'll call it a constant. It's a variable that's not going to change. Once we establish that variable, we're not going to change it throughout our program. Like that rate is going to be the rate for everything. So we're going to call it a constant. Any constant variables you have in your program, we put them in all capital letters. Okay. So to kind of remember in my pseudocode that I'm going to have a constant that's not going to change, I'm going to write this in all capital letters and put an underscore between the two. And I'm going to say it's going to be 0.02, which means it's 2%. We can change that value at the top. It's not set forever, but you can't change it throughout your program. You can only change the initialization the one time you give it a value, and then you can't change it anywhere else. Like you can't say later the commission percent is something else and have it be one, you know, percent in part of your program and another percent in another part. It has to stay the same. Okay. And the other thing we need to keep track of is how many shares we have. So we're going to call it number of shares. And this is where you can think about your variable names, like what would be a good variable name. And I'm going to put a question there because that value can actually be any value you want. We can change it. So because we can change it, I'm going to put a question mark there. Okay, so number of shares. Do I have to call it num shares? No, I could have wrote number of shares. I could just write shares. I could just write number. But if I write number, it might be confusing, like number of what? Like sometimes you might want to be a little more descriptive. And I capitalized the S because I had two words. And if I didn't capitalize the S, it'd be hard to tell the difference between the two words. And so it's common to capitalize the second word. And the first letter gets a lowercase unless it's a constant. And then you have all capital letters. Okay, so everybody with me so far? I don't have to say the data types here because it's just the pseudocode. But if you want to put the data types, if you're thinking about it, you can. This is a way for you to take notes and just kind of write down what you're trying to achieve. So what else do I have to know? I have to know the price. Okay, so we'll say price here. And what's the price? You could write price per share if you think it's confusing. Or you could just write price if you think that's good. And then you can put a little comment in your code, price per share, you know, so people know. But then, you know, if you just write price, you don't have to write that in your equation and everything. It's a longer name if you write price per share. So really up to you. Okay, now we're going to do a calculation. We're going to have a variable called stock, and we're going to put equals, and the stock is going to be the price times how many shares you have. So we'll say number of shares. So it's an equation. Don't worry about Notepad, you know, underlining things that it thinks is misspelled. It's not worried about it. Okay. And then we're going to do the commission. So we're going to have a variable called commission. And that's going to be whatever the stock is times the commission percent, which you can just copy from up here. Okay. So if we know the price times the number of shares, the stock, and then the commission is the stock times the commission percent, then if we add those two together, then we can get the total. So we can have a total variable, and we can say, what is the stock plus the commission? Now, if you want to, you can put some spaces in here if you think that's hard to read. Oops. I mean to hit enter there. Why does it do that? Here, I'm out of space here. Trying to put some spaces in here in case that's hard to read. Okay, and then what else would we like to do? Well, so we have our variables up here. These are the variables we're going to need. But then we also have these two variables. We'll also have to make sure we declare and tell the editor what type of variables those are. What are they? Are they ints or doubles? So we'll think about that in just a second. We have this total variable as well. But now we have the answers. We have this commission that we worked on, this total. So we have to print off these values. So the next thing I want to think about is what do we want to print? Well, let's print the stock price. Let's print the commission price. That was what we calculated. And then let's print the total cost. So if we don't print those values, we won't know what they are because we calculated the commission and the total. So if we don't print them, we won't know. All of those values were calculated. So if we don't print them, we won't know the answers. So these were the calculations up here. We already know this. We could print those if you want, but that information's in our program. But we can print that if you wanted to. But these are the calculated values, so we need to make sure we print them. Is everybody following the pseudocode so far? Do they have any questions? Okay, so I'm going to leave this up so we can take a look at this while we're doing our code. So what we want to do is we want to first make sure we have our comments at the top. And I put these up there. Hopefully you got these up there. You always want your name and the date and then a little basic description about what the program does. Okay. And then I always add this using namespace std, so I don't have to do it with all my couts, which will be these print statements. So I suggest you do that unless you want to add that. Okay. And so I'm going to go in here and do this. See if I can get this to be on the side here. Okay. So if I go over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start with my variables. So first start with the commission percent, and I have to decide what type of variable that is. So it's a decimal number. So does anybody have a data type they think it is? Double works. Yep. Double. Okay. And then when you're doing it, just capitalize it just like we did in our pseudocode. So if you actually just want to copy this, you can. Make sure you have an underscore between the two words, because if you don't put the underscore, it's hard to read the two words if you push them together. And by the way, the 0 here is optional before the decimal point. You don't have to put it if you don't want to, but sometimes it makes it easier to read if you put it before the decimal, but it's not required. You can also put spaces before and after the equals if you like to. Some people like to have that spaced out if it makes it easier to read. And then make sure you put a semicolon at the end to say you're finished. So the statement, variable initialization, and put a semicolon. So we declared that we have this variable called commission percent. Just doing it in capital letters doesn't actually make it a constant though. So I wanted to talk about this. So I declared that it's a double. I did put it in capital letters, which typically represents a constant, but I didn't tell it was a constant. And then I initialized it with 0.02. But I do need to tell C++ that it's a constant, because otherwise somebody could change the value of it later. So if a variable is a constant, you do want to put it in capital letters, but that doesn't actually make it a constant. So if you put const in front of it, then it makes it a constant. All that does is say that later in your program, you can't say commission percent equals and change the value. But you can change it here where you initialize it. Like if you decide it's not 0.2, it's 0.03, if it's 3% or it's gone up or it's gone down. You can change it there, but you can't change it throughout your program. Yes.
Is there a reason you used a double instead of a float when it's only 0.02?
No, because I just asked and everybody went with double. You could totally do float, yeah. Float would save some space. Float makes it a little more difficult because then you have to put like the F after it, which totally fine. Sometimes it forces you because it won't allow you to, but then in some versions it'll condense it for you. So and then you have to make sure that if you are going to use a float in your equation, if you use actual numbers that you do put F after them, make sure that they are, not doubles so that they don't. C++ is better than some other languages, that it does have a tendency to kind of fix things for you. May fix it the right way, may not fix it the right way, but it doesn't error out like some other languages, like Java will be like, no. C++ will just do whatever it does to make it work. So it usually doesn't stop your program. But okay, so yeah, you could use a float, that's fine. I usually just go with double if it's a decimal and int if it's a whole number, but totally if you want to go with float. The only time I say not to go with float is if you're calculating the price. So when you're calculating the price, go with double because that gives you more precision and it's good to have precision when you're working with monetary amounts. But otherwise you can save space and go with float. That's completely fine. Good question. Okay. Everybody good? All right. So the next thing is the number of shares, and this is where you can make up a number. So we haven't talked about how to do input yet. Whenever we talk about input, we would ask the user how many shares and they would input this value. But because we don't know how to do that yet, then we're just going to put a value in there. But we need to think about number of shares. You can't have a decimal number of shares. Like you can't buy half of a share. You have to buy a full share. So what would be a good data type for this? Int's good. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna see int, and we're gonna see number of shares, and I said num shares here. I'm just sticking with what I have in my pseudocode over here, and I didn't give it a value in my pseudocode because this is a value that you can keep making up a different number for. So whatever you think, we could put like 750 little shares, and then you can change that value later. Okay, so we handled this part. Now we need to go to the price. The price is also something that could change, and that would be something that would probably be user input, but we don't know how to do that yet. Price, you don't want to do integer because you might have a decimal number for the price. So we can either go with double or float. So, oops, not over here. Okay, so over here we could do double. And you could just do price. Again, that's what I did over here. If you think it's confusing, you could do price per share. And then you just want to put a price in there. So you don't have to put a decimal number just because it's a double data type. If you want to put 35.00, you can, but you don't have to. It'll automatically add the 0.0. If you think it's confusing, your variable, you can either change the variable name or you could just put a little comment here that says price per share so that anyone had any question if that's like the total amount or if that's per share. Then they can see that there, that little note. So this is kind of like a little note to them. Okay, that's per share. Okay, so now we handle that. So next we need to do the equation. Now we have this new variable that we're going to save it into. So when we calculate the price times the number of shares to figure out how much it costs, we need to put this in a variable. So we need to have a variable for it, but I don't have one yet. So I can either declare that I have the variable and put the equation all in the same line, or I could declare the variable and then put the equation later. So it's really up to you. I usually just do it all at once, right? Because you have to declare it anyways. You could just declare it all in the same line. Unless you have a reason why that would be something when we talk about like scope of variables, then you might want to declare it in different places. But for right now, it probably makes sense to just do it here. So we're going to say double. And we're going to say stock equals, and then it is the variable that you use, which is price, times the number of shares, which is the exact thing I wrote in my pseudocode, number of shares. And then make sure you put a semicolon at the end. And if you think you need to explain that statement, if you think it's confusing in any way, you can put a little comment there. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but if you want to say anything about it, you can. Is everybody following so far? Okay. All right, next we need to do this one, which is we're going to figure out the commission. So the commission is going to be the stock times the commission percent. That's that 0.02 that I have up here. Okay, so we have to define or declare what the commission variable is because it doesn't know what that is. So if we just say the same thing that I have here, it'll give me an error because it doesn't know what commission is. So I'm just going to stick with double on this. Oops, I keep doing that because I have it highlighted over there. So we're going to tell it what commission is because it doesn't know. So we have to say double commission. So it knows what that variable type is. Every time you have a variable, you always have to say the data type. Now you could use auto and let it figure out what it is, but you have to say something. Okay. All right. Now it's stock, which I have here, times commission percent. And if you had the same variable names here, you could probably just copy this, save yourself some time and put a semicolon at the end. If you use the same variable names as you did in your pseudocode, just make sure everything looks good. So it's the same thing you're doing up here, commission percent times the stock. The stock is what we just calculated on the previous line. And now we need the total. So we have the stock, so price times the number of shares. And then we have the commission if we take the stock times the commission percent. And now if we add them both together, we can get the total. Now it doesn't know what total is yet because we didn't tell it what total is. So we have to tell it, okay, what data type is total? So we'll go with double again. And then we can just take the stock plus the commission. And if you use the same names, you can just copy this. Make sure you put a semicolon at the end. And then of course, C++ doesn't know what print is. This was English version. Now I need to put it in C++ version. This was just telling me don't forget to print. Pseudocode can be however you want to write it. So there's no real like, I'm not picky about how you do it. I just want to see that you thought about the process before you do it. So if you don't put like the data types of the variable, that you need to do when you get to C++. I just want to know that you thought about the equations, you thought about the variables, and what you thought about what you needed to print. Okay, so you're thinking about the calculations and everything ahead of time and what information you need. And so this is just a basic, kind of notes for you to don't forget to do this type of thing. And so however you want to write that. So this isn't the way you write it in code, but that reminds you, oh, I need to print the stock. Okay, so the stock was what we calculated up here. So in C++, you're going to have to say C out. Now, I don't like it when you just do this, because now I don't know what that value is. Like when it prints that value, I don't know what it is. It might not be clear. So you need to put a label with it. Okay, instead of just printing values to the screen without a label, you always should have a label that says what value you're printing. So you don't have to put it in sentence form. Like you don't have to say the stock is, and then put the stock value, but you can say stock colon and then or stock equals and then put it, but let me know what that value is. And so you do that by putting it in quotes, and you could do something like this. That's what I typically do. And so you have to have some sort of label. So the label goes in quotes, and you should have a space between the label and the actual value, but the space has to be in the quotes. It can't be out of the quotes. And then you have to put the arrows again before you put the variable name. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Now, if you leave it like this and you go on with the next line to do the print commission, you won't have an empty line between the two. It'll push the two up on the same line. So we either have to use \n, which you would put arrow, arrow, and then inside quotes put a \n, which is one option, or you put end L. Okay. So at the end of here, we can just do end L if that works for everybody. Okay, and then on the next line, you would do the print for the commission. And same thing, you're going to need a label. So put your commission. And this is how you want it to be displayed. So if you wanted to start with a capital letter, then start with a capital letter. This is the label. So it has nothing to do with what you named your variable. So, make it look nice because that's what people are going to see. Okay, make your variables follow the rules by starting with a lowercase letter. But when you're doing output, your labels should look nice because that's what people are going to see. And then we're going to do whatever you named your commission variable, which is right here. So I did that with a lowercase. Whoops, there's two M's. Make sure you spell it correctly. And then put an end L at the end so you get an extra line. And then we want to print the total. And the total is our third equation right here. Okay. So then same thing, put a label, make it look nice, and then make sure you use the variable name you used. This one, you don't have to put end L because it's the last statement. So there isn't anything printing afterwards, but if you just want to keep and put it in case you add something later, it's probably a good idea, but it's not required. Okay, now I think that I'm good. I think that that looks good. So I will run it. You could always run it as you go. Like if you wanted to do the stock one and run it and then test it, you could test them one by one. But let's try it and see if it works. I conquered everything on my pseudocode. Hopefully it works. Okay, let's see. So I have to do this. And so I am not worried about formatting because we haven't talked about that yet. We will talk about that. Okay. So I want you to see if the values that you have make sense. That's a lot, but I did buy 750 shares. So if it's working and you think it looks good, I want you to take your code and copy it. And what I will say is one shortcut you can do is if you click in the code and you do Control A, it'll highlight everything. Because sometimes I have students when they go highlight everything, sometimes they miss a curly brace or something. And if you miss a curly brace, then the whole program doesn't work when I copy it and I try it. So if you want to make sure you have it all, go in the right pane and do Control A and then Control C to copy. And then that pseudocode thing that you had before, that window that you had, the notepad, go ahead and paste your code in there. And mine looks bad because it needs, extended because I have it so large. So that means you would have your pseudocode above as an example, and then you would have your code. And then underneath your code, I want you to do your output. And your output example would be this one. You would just copy and paste. Oops, that didn't work. Try that again. Copy this. I must have had the previous one. Why does it keep doing that? Copy. Okay. So that's one example. And then what I want you to do is I want you to change like the number of shares to be a different number. I always want you to test your program at least 2 times. Now, if you have decisions in your program, which we haven't gotten to yet, but when we talk about decisions, then you need to test each decision at least once. Okay. But now if you're just doing calculations, you should test it at least 2 times and make sure that the output makes sense. Okay. Because sometimes you might get lucky and you might think it works, but then you test it again, you realize that that output doesn't make sense. Okay. So try different numbers, try a different number for the number of shares. So we could try 200, $10 a share, any number you want. Okay. And then just take that output and copy it and then paste it over here underneath so that I can see that you tried at least 2 times. Okay. And this is the kind of layout that I want for your assignment. And that's why I'm doing this, because in your assignment, it'll say, do the pseudocode first, because I want you to think about the problems first. And the pseudocode, as long as it makes sense and you're putting like the calculation and, you have some thought process behind what you're doing, that's good. That counts. And then you have your code and then you have your output. And I want you to try it 2 times. Okay. So that tells me that you tried your program 2 times, because sometimes I will have students that turn in an assignment and never ran it, and then it doesn't work, right? I'm like, did you run this? Well, it looks good, but it didn't actually work. Okay. Right, is everybody with me? Does yours work? Did you try it 2 times? And then whenever you have this, go ahead and save this. And you don't have to turn this into me. This is just practice example. But I would say that this would be a good example for doing like your assignment and doing the coding checkpoint. So make sure you save it. So we're gonna do save as and give it a name that makes sense to you, because this is your example to work from. I'm not collecting it. So I would create like a chapter 2 folder if you haven't already done so, and put this in your chapter 2 folder with all your other examples. And then when you go to look for it, if you give it a name that makes sense, you'll be able to find it. You'll say, oh, that's the one with the equations with the stock. So if you want to call it like stocks or stock commission, something like that, you can leave it as a text file. And just put it, if you have a flash drive, put it on your flash drive. If you don't, make sure you send it to yourself. And then you know that this is the code. You can actually paste this into online GDB or C++ shell to test it out. And you can actually have multiple tabs in online GDB. So if you wanted to have multiple programs, or if you like having them as text files, whatever works for you. But you know that you have this example. That way, you know, if you need to do something similar, you can look at this as a reference.
I have a question. For signups like for submission, since you have us like run it out like twice and we're like entering in new values and we do that, do you want us to know the values that we?
No, you don't.
Okay.
I can just figure out if the output makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. And you can just send me the text file, or if you do the CPP file, you could just add to it as comments, just add the output as comments and the pseudocode in the top. Either is fine. Okay, does this make sense to everybody? Awesome. Okay, so this was one example again. Make sure you saved it. I want to do another one with you. So we'll go ahead and start the same kind of thing here. We'll start with the pseudocode and we'll talk about the problem first. And then we'll do a new program here. Okay, so make sure you save this and then we're going to go ahead and clear this out. Okay, and you can leave your name and your date, of course, but we're going to go ahead and see that this program is going to be about a restaurant bill. So we're going to calculate the tip and how much the total is and everything. Okay, so what I need to do is first get my pseudocode up, okay, and think about what I'm doing here. So I'm going to think about what the tax rate is, okay? So we're going to first create a variable. This is going to be a constant variable, so I'm going to put in all capital letters. So what is the tax rate? So we'll say like 0.0675. You can change that. You can change it at the top where it's initialized, but you can't change it throughout your program if it's a constant. So remember the capital letters represents constant. So I'm going to have to put that in my code when I do it. And then the tip, you can make that a constant too if you want, if you're always going to tip the same amount. Now, like, of course, I guess that could change based on, you know, the service that you're provided, but a typical tipping amount is 20% nowadays, I think. So you can do 0.2. Now you don't have to put 0.2. You could just put 0.2 if that, you know, is easy for you to read. Okay, so 0.2 is the tip. And again, I capitalized it because I'm going to make it a constant because I always give 20%, but you can always change that again, what you initialize. Okay, so the cost of the bill is something that can change. So we're going to make that whatever value we want when we do the program. Now, again, this will become input from the user whenever we learn how to do input. So this variable that's changing is going to be input from the user. So that's why I put a question mark there. So that's what we're hoping to get to in the next chapter. Okay, so the cost, the tax, we're going to have a variable for the tax. The tax is going to be the cost of the bill. So we'll say cost times whatever the tax rate is, which is the capital tax, which is up here, this 0.0675. So the tax is going to be the cost times the tax, which is up here. That's how much you're paying in taxes. Now, the tip is going to be the cost plus the tax, okay? So we have to add that. So we're going to do cost plus the tax. Now, it's also going to be multiplied times the tip. Now, bear with me. I wanted to do a program that's a little more complicated. It's very hard to make programs that only have two things that you're working with in a calculation. So instead of creating another variable to do this, I think that this will make sense because most of you have had a math class where you've done parentheses, right? You've done order operations. We are going to talk a lot about order operations in the next chapter, but I wanted to kind of bring this in. I don't think it's complicated. Hopefully it won't be too much for you. What we're going to do is we're going to put parentheses around this, cost plus tax, to tell it to do that first. Okay. And then we're going to tell it to multiply that value that it gets times the tip. So the order of operations, this is a hopefully not too bad, tells us to do the adding of the cost plus the tax, and then the multiplying times the tip. So I know that this chapter doesn't talk about 3 variables and 1 equation, but hopefully it's not too bad because we're just gonna, it only handles 2 variables at a time, 2 values at a time. So it handles the cost plus the tax, and then it multiplies whatever that value is times the tip. And the tip is the 0.2, which is the 20%. Does that make sense to everybody? Everybody following so far? Not too bad. Okay, that's, the next one is also gonna have 3 values, but this one's very simple. So it's gonna be the total that you're paying. So the total is gonna be the cost of the bill plus the tax that you calculated plus the tip. So that's how much you're paying altogether. I'm gonna put some spaces so you can see. Now I know this has 3 variables, but hopefully not too bad because there's no order. It's just adding all. It's gonna add the cost plus the tax, and once it gets that, then I'll add it to the tip. But it's all addition, so you don't have to worry about the order. Okay. Everybody with me? Not too bad. I know I'm working with more than 1 or more than 2 variables, but hopefully not too bad. Okay, then now that I have that, that's all I wanted to do. If I left it like this, though, I wouldn't see the answers. I wouldn't see the results. So I have to make sure I think about what I want to print. Oops. So down here, I want to put in my pseudocode what I want to print. So I'm going to print the, the tax. And I'm going to print the tip. And I'm going to print the total. Those are the 3 things I calculated. The tax, the tip, and the total. Now, if you want to, because this was asked before, it wouldn't be a bad idea to also print the cost of the meal. Because that way you have that in your output. Because that is something that's going to be in your code, but not in your output. And so you might ask what was the cost of the meal? And so it might be a good idea to print that. Now, when we get to input, you'll see that value because you'll say, what's the cost of the meal? And you'll be inputting it. So you'll know what that value is because you inputted it. But when it's stuck in the code, it is kind of probably a good idea to make sure you print it so everybody knows what it is. But you could look in your code and see it. But we're getting input in the next chapter. And so that'll be helpful. Okay. So was everybody okay with the pseudocode so far? Not too bad? Okay, so then what I want to do is go over here. And I want to first start with my variables that I have. So I have, let me make this smaller. I have my tax at the top, and that's a constant. So I know I have to put CONST. We talked about that for constants. And then I put the data type, which it is a decimal. It could be float or double. Okay, but I do have to go with a decimal data type. And then just put it in all capital letters because it's a constant. And then we're going to put 0.0675. And then make sure you put a semicolon at the end to say you're finished with that variable declaration and initialization. So again, the CONST stands for constant. That means that once this is given a value, it's not going to change. That value is not going to change. And the same thing for tip. I'm also going to make that a constant. So CONST. And I usually just stick with doubles just to make things easier. But you can always go with float if you know you want to save space. If you want to do that, that's fine. So decimals, I usually just default to double. Okay, just to make it easier on you. Tip, and then 0.2. Okay, so I handled the first 2 variables, right? I got the tax and the tip, and they're both constants. Is everybody following so far? Okay, so now I need to do the cost. It needs to know what data type the cost is. Okay, so because the cost could be a decimal number, then I'm just going to default with double. Okay, and then I'm just going to put a number in there. You can put whatever you want for your cost. Okay, so we'll say double. Oops, I have that highlighted. Okay, double, and this is not a constant. So we're going to say double cost equals, because this would typically be input. So we're not going to make it a constant because that value is coming from the user. And it's also something we can validate in the future. And so we're not going to make that a constant. So you can put whatever you want for your bill. I'll put 88.67, but you can put whatever. Don't put the $sign. Just put the number with the decimal. Okay, and then we need to handle this equation. So how do we figure out the tax? The tax would be the cost times the tax rate, which is 0.0675. So we'll see. We need to also establish what the tax variable is. So is it double, is it an int? So we're going to say double tax equals, and this is a lowercase tax. This is a lowercase tax. The capital tax is the rate, and the lowercase tax is going to be what the cost plus, or the cost times the tax is. So cost times the tax rate. And so you can have a variable named tax that's capital and a variable named tax that's lowercase. And C++ will know the difference based on the capitalization. Okay, so one is the actual rate and one is what it is when it's calculated. So the one that here is lowercase, but the one with the rate is the capital up here. Okay. Then we want to create a tip variable. And I know you're going to be looking up there and saying we already have a tip variable, but that one's the constant, that's the rate. And if you don't like that, you could say like tip percent or something, put an underscore between it instead of calling it tip and tip, because it does know the difference because one's capital and one's lowercase. But if you don't like having two tip variables, one capital, one lowercase, you could change the name of them. Just don't call it T because T could stand for total or tax or tip. And so it's T is kind of confusing as to what it is. So be a little more descriptive than that. So we are going to create a tip variable, and this one's going to be lowercase. And this one is the one that has the parentheses. So make sure you put parentheses, cost plus the tax in parentheses, and then multiply that times the tip. And this tip has to be capital because that's going to use the rate up there. Again, if you want to say tax rate with the underscore, if you don't want it to just be tax, if that's confusing to have two tips and two tax variables, you could do that. You could change them. It just makes a little more typing. So. Okay, and then we have to do the total. So I have to declare a total variable to save it into. So I'm going to say double total equals, and this is going to be the cost plus the tax plus the tip. Make sure you use the right tip and the right places. So this tip is the calculated tip, not the tip amount, the percent. Otherwise, you'll get a different answer, right? It'll work. It'll give you an answer, but just not the right answer. And then once I have that, I have to go ahead and print everything. You could do it step by step if you want to make sure it's working. So, I could do like a cout statement here, and I could say, okay, I'm going to print the cost first. You could say bill, cost. Okay. And then you're going to print the cost. And I'm going to put an end L because I know I'm going to have other statements in there. And if you want to run it and make sure that that's correct, that it gives you the same number you have up here, then that would probably be good just to make sure you don't have any errors so far. And then once you have that, then you can move on to the next step. We can print the tax. That's that first calculation that we have there. Okay, we know what the bill is. Then what is it with the tax? So then we have to do another cout statement with the tax. And you might put tax amount. Now that would be the tax all lowercase. And then run it. And for right now, I know that the format is not super nice, but if you want to put like a $sign here, you could at least put like a $sign here for now, just to get a $sign, but I know you can't format the 2 decimal places yet. So it just makes it look a little nicer, but I know we have more numbers here, which looks unusual, but we'll fix that in the future. Okay, and then we need to print the tip. And this is the tip that was calculated, not the tip percentage. So we'll say tip amount. And then you can put a $sign if you want to. And then do the lowercase tip because that's the calculated one. And then we're going to do the total. I'll do total amount. And then you should get something that makes sense with whatever number you picked for the cost. Hopefully. And if it doesn't make sense, then make sure you go back and check your calculations and make sure you have the right tax in there and tips with the capitalizations correctly. Make sure that it looks reasonable. And if it does work, go ahead and take the code that you have and paste it into your notepad. and then also paste your output in there. So you have your output example. So again, Control A and Control C is an easy way to make sure that you're not missing anything for your code. And then down here, you can highlight and you can copy. It wasn't working when I did Control C, so I'm gonna try it this way. Okay, and then always make sure you test it 2 times. So for the second time, make sure you pick a different number for the cost and run it again and see if that number makes sense. You don't always have to use the same numbers I have. You can use whatever number you want. So if you want to do a smaller bill and see if it makes sense, so. And again, I know the format has more than 2 decimal places, so it looks kind of odd, but we are going to talk about this in the next chapter. And so that's okay. Just worry about that later. We're also going to talk about input. And then once you have that, go ahead and save this as something that makes sense to you. So you can say restaurant bill if you want to. Whatever is going to help you remember that when you're looking for an example, what was this? So you can say, oh yeah, that might be helpful for this. Okay. I have my pseudocode and then I have my code and then I did my output, my 2 different examples to make sure I tested it 2 times. Now, the other thing I want to tell you is there's going to be, especially as we go, there's going to be a variety of ways to do it. So my way isn't the only way to do it. You might have a different way. Okay, let me look at it in just a second. So I just want to show you something quickly. So instead of doing end L, for example, this is another way. You don't have to change a program, but you might see people do this and you might not like it. You might like it with the end L. So I just want you to be, prepared that there's other ways to do it. So to get a extra line, you might see people do that \n. That gets you a separate line before each one of these. Okay, so that looks kind of strange, but that's a little less typing. So you might see people do that, and that actually has the same results. And so it really doesn't matter which of those 2 ways you do it, but I just want you to get used to other people will code different ways, because most of the time, if you're going to be working on coding projects, you're going to be working with other people, and they may think differently than you, so they might not do it the way you would have done it, but you have to understand what they did when they did it when you see the code. So just because you choose not to use this way, it's fine the other way. But you should understand what that does if you saw that, so that you recognize like, oh, I wouldn't typically do it this way, but yeah, that does the same thing, right? Is everybody okay with that? Okay, so I'll try to show you different ways, and you may even like pick a different way than I do it. If I use end out, you might say like, I like \n. You can do that. That's fine. That's great. And as we go through, I'll try to show you multiple ways to do it. So it's fine to do it a different way. Okay. So make sure you have these saved. And I'm going to go ahead and shut this off.